It's your boy, Remoy, George Philip, the first.
And I'm Samantha Zessi Kifler.
This is Masculinity.
The show that investigates the performance of masculinity in the world today, and you know we spell it with a hard K.
Okay, Samantha.
Yes, Remoy?
I hear you've been trying to replace me.
Wow. Remoy the journalist out here, just breaking news.
I can read it now. The headline reads, Masculinity Podcast in Disarray.
Wow. He's back and he's coming in so hot. Just so hot, isn't he, folks?
It's election season, baby. You gotta be fired up.
Okay, I wasn't replacing you. Let's just say I was out in the field gathering tape.
Oh, is that what that was? Full-on interviews without me?
Audience, what Remoy is alluding to is how the very highly respected Pew Research Center got in touch with us about a new report they just filed.
Hell yes, they did.
It sheds some light on some, let's just say, discoveries about the American public and their thinking around gender.
And from what I gather, what you're saying is it reveals some surprises along the way?
Yeah, I got the chance to talk with the Senior Associate Director in Research, Juliana Horowitz, to get a better understanding of all the paper's intricacies.
But you just didn't stop with Juliana, did you?
Oh my God. Okay, so the Texan in him is so dramatic these days. Like, wow.
She tried to replace me. You tried to replace me.
Okay, what Remoy's speaking about is that at the same time I spoke with Juliana, I brought out Trevor Mayoh from our presenting sponsor, Next Gen Men, to help add some color to those understandings. And turns out Trevor, being a neighbor from the north, let's just say he was ready to jump in, okay?
Oh, come on. Throw some more salt in my abandonment wounds, why don't you? Come on.
Actually, it's more like your whole anti-political punditry persona that I was just equalizing, okay, with Trevor's interest in politics.
Okay.
Actually, he had a cute way to describe his fandom, so.
I'm also a political nerd, so hopefully I can add some context there.
And you won't hate this.
You abandoned me and you still think you know me?
Well, I gave Juliana a pop quiz. Thought you might like that. So, Juliana, you're a doctor of political science, and I know you're an expert test taker. So, pop quiz.
Oh, no.
Gotcha. No. So, what are we talking about on the show today?
We are talking about some new research that we've done on how the public sees men and masculinity today, and how people rate their own masculinity and femininity, and do they think masculinity is under attack, and a lot of the things that we've been talking about societally for the last few years.
I can't be mad at any other self-identifying nerds.
Well, there's plenty more tape I'd love to get into your ears.
Okay, now you're judging my ears?
Well, folks, we'll get into more of Remoy's operatic sensitivity and ears, I guess.
Oh, okay, I never thought I'd hear that one before.
And some better understanding about the interactions between masculinity with a hard K and politics in this American election season. That's just around the corner. Stay tuned.
Curious about Next Gen Men? We're a small part of a much larger movement to undefine masculinity for a brighter future. Our mission is clear: empower the next generation to use their curiosity, empathy, and courage to build a more equitable world. Join the Next Gen Men community as we learn and unlearn together. We're here to support boys and men to break free from limiting stereotypes. We're not just an organization, we're a catalyst for reimagining masculinity and fostering inclusivity. We're here to help open up possibilities for what men and boys can be. Explore the world of Next Gen Men at nextgenmen.ca and join the community to make a difference. Next Gen Men, shaping tomorrow's leaders one step at a time. Join us and help undefine masculinity and empower the next generation of men to lead with empathy and courage.
Samantha?
Yes, Remoy?
Since I've been MIA, what's the story on this report? They reached out to you, right?
Yeah. The report is called How Americans See Men and Masculinity, and Pew reached out shortly before it was released on October 17th.
Okay, well, what's the backstory on the report?
Well, I actually asked Juliana about that.
Sometimes these conversations can get pretty polarized, like everything else in our society these days. And a lot of it is anecdotal, and, which doesn't mean it's not valid, doesn't mean that it's not helpful, but we wanted to come in with some nationally representative, non-advocacy, non-partisan data to understand where the public was when it came to some of these things. And then, of course, this summer, as the dynamics in the election changed, the candidates changed, the running mates were selected, and there was more of a conversation, both because of how the RNC this summer sort of presented masculinity, and then conversations around how the DNC was displaying masculinity with Tim Walz and Doug Emhoff. And, and so the conversation ended up turning to be more related to the election, which is not how we started out with this project, but the timing sort of all worked out.
Yeah, I can imagine with like Biden dropping out and Kamala stepping into the cut, there's like more impetus for this report.
Exactly. It's like it magnified everything.
Okay, well, let's not hold back. Stop holding back. Like, what does the report say? Like, what's kind of the startling revelations?
Well, how about I ask you a question first?
You and all the questions. Wow.
Well, I'm going to give you some terms or ideas, okay? Are you ready?
Okay, yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so what do you think when you hear of the association between the American public and the terms caring, open about their emotions, soft-spoken, or affectionate?
Oh, okay, yeah. Those are like super like liberal progressive words associated with gender and masculinity for sure.
Okay, interesting. I'm glad you said that. With those terms in mind, how would you say Americans across the aisle appreciate the value that our society places on them?
Oh, it's super easy. It's kind of like just what I said. Like liberal progressive people place super high values on them, or more high values on them, I guess.
Okay.
I guess what you're asking is like Republicans. I'd like to give them some sort of benefit of the doubt, but you know how we see it play out with Trump and just that party in general. Like, I'd say they don't hold those terms highly, especially when it comes to like men and masculinity.
Well, to be honest, I thought the same thing, but interestingly, it turns out that's not what Juliana and her team found.
Yeah, so both men and women, majorities of men and women, said that society doesn't place enough value on those traits for men, like being caring, being open about their emotions, being affectionate. And I mean, even among, and we see big partisan differences too, but even among Republicans, I mean, it's not a majority, but more of them say that there's not enough value placed on these traits for men.
Wait, hold up, what?
Yep. And then Juliana had more to say.
Like the quote unquote feminization of men, and is that something people see as a problem. And we don't see evidence that Americans necessarily think masculinity is under attack. For the most part, people don't think that others in our society have negative views of men who are masculine. And people don't think there's enough value placed on men who have these traits that traditionally might have been more associated with women. So it's not that like people are, saying that those traits shouldn't be valued. Like they actually don't think they're valued enough. And so I think that sort of speaks a little bit to the fact that I think this is just a little bit more nuanced. We can't just put people neatly in these boxes.
This is honestly fascinating and surprising.
It is for so many reasons. And our discussion went even further.
Yeah, but still, it's like, I'm kind of shocked, honestly.
Well, you like this one. You've talked often about how you just want to be a house husband and have a badass wifey, paying all the bills, bringing home that bacon.
I mean, you mean vegan bacon? Yes, absolutely. I want that.
I do mean vegan bacon, Well, how do you think your feelings compare with the rest of American men? Like, are you in the minority or majority?
I mean, before this, I thought I was in the minority, but now you have me like second guessing. I'm not sure.
Second guessing, the fired up Texan looking less sure. Okay, that's interesting.
Bro, chill out. Don't remind me. Calm down.
Okay, so here's what Juliana found.
We had these questions about, whether it's acceptable or not acceptable for, or how acceptable it is for men in a relationship with women to take care of the home and children while their wife works for pay, to take charge in day-to-day decisions about the relationship, to split the bill when out on a date, and to take their wife's name when they get married. But it was interesting because on the one about taking care of the home and children while their wife works for pay, 57% of Americans find that extremely or very acceptable, right? And so again, like that goes with, thinking maybe society isn't acceptable enough of men who take on roles typically associated with women. And a majority of Americans find it acceptable for men to do that, which I thought was a really interesting finding too.
So you're telling me a majority of Americans think similar to me. A majority of Americans are this thoughtful. Like my individuality, my Remoyness feels like it's being under attack here. Is that what this paper was for?
So that's what you heard in that, huh? Good to hear your ego is still on fire.
Look, man, male fragility. What do you expect, dog?
Okay, but for what it's worth, it surprised me too. You know, it's not a 90% majority, but across the aisle, it was still more than half. But there was one stat about this that actually did make me laugh.
Okay, don't hold back.
What percentage think it's okay for a man to take a woman's last name in marriage? Adam, anyway.
I mean, before this paper, because of this paper, I think it's like, 57%? It's like the majority now because everything's the wrong majority. I don't know.
Okay, well, this is actually where Americans said enough is enough, all right? And only 23% said it was extremely or very acceptable, which is hilarious.
I mean, that's a small number, but honestly, it's larger than I expect, especially for America. Like, I don't know, is this place more progressive than I thought? I'm confused.
You know, that's fair. And I feel like I keep mentioning our interview here on reproductive justice, but Heidi Seek did warn us that Republican politicians, all the ones that are high up there in the limelight, are just excellent at creating narratives to make Americans seem more conservative than they are, to make America seem more conservative than it is as a country. But I digress, you know. Juliana actually had another finding, and this time it was related to toxic masculinity.
Yeah. So that was a really interesting finding. We asked a series of behaviors, and we asked people how the extent to which they find it acceptable for men to do some of these things, to show some of these behaviors. And the majority said that they find it unacceptable for men to throw a punch if provoked, to have many different sexual partners rather than committing to one relationship, to join in when other men make sexual comments about women. And so majorities of men said that they found those things to be unacceptable. And I mean, we did see some differences by party, but for the most part, so for example, like on the item on throwing a punch if provoked, I think that was one of where we saw some of the biggest differences, but still it was a majority. It was 68% of Democrats compared to 57% of Republicans who said that that was not acceptable for men. So it was a majority of Republicans, and this is Republicans overall. We didn't see huge differences by gender.
Wow, so Americans are seemingly not proponents of this hyper-toxic masculinity, at least generally speaking.
I mean, it does look that way, which is wild to me.
But what about how some people, especially those conservative pundits you were referring to, would say that masculinity is under attack? Like, those are some of the individuals promoting that aforementioned toxic masculinity, no?
Juliana has a finding for the American public in general, and if they feel that masculinity, traditionally speaking, is under attack.
We did ask how they think other people in our society see men. And for the most part, they think that most people either have positive or neutral views of men. So Americans aren't necessarily seeing sort of like a backlash against men. And we specifically asked about men who are manly or masculine. So we try to paint a picture. We didn't define for them what we meant by that, but we didn't just say negative views of men, right? We said negative views of men who are manly or masculine. And, most people don't see a backlash against men who are manly or masculine. A quarter did say that they think people have mostly negative views of masculine men, and Republican men were the most likely to say that. And so, right, Republican men are the most likely to sort of see masculine men as being under attack. But it was still not a majority, though it was much higher than the shares of Republican women or Democratic men or women. But overall, no, the Americans don't overall see masculine men as necessarily being under attack or that there's a backlash against masculinity.
This is honestly wild to be confronted with. We're a few days, less than a week from the election, and I don't know how to process this information.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the way that we've been seeing this for almost a decade now is this virulent hyper-masculinity ever present in American culture. At least it seems that way. Trump kind of made that clear with how the voters turned out for him in 2016 and even in 2020 or January 6th and so on.
Oof. And honestly, it would still seem that way.
Yeah, I mean, God, that rally in New York the other day, that made me literally so nauseous.
I mean, that's That was wild, right? Like, I heard about that. And honestly, the only thing I have to say is shout out to Puerto Rico.
They still had they had the hindsight of like what happened with the Nazis, and yet they still like were laughing at it almost and like mimicking a Nazi rally in the middle. That's wild. It's crazy. I mean, but with that in mind, like, how do we split the difference, right? Because like, it seems like, and there is this over the top call for a traditional quote unquote masculinity, but Juliana's findings are, as she puts it, more nuanced than that.
Well, Remoy, this is why I spoke to Trevor. He was able to offer some thoughtful insight.
You know, I'm sitting there and it lands in so many different ways, because I think what we forget that like the politics is real versus the politics is sport. And the politics of sport is commentary, that's talking points, that's very tribal, that's people going on the area, and you're like trying to talk to win and talk down and all that. But then when you look at like the real politic of like what the day-to-day feels like when people look to a local leader or to a president or what have you, I think it factors a little bit differently in terms of what they want. And so I think there is that conflict that people have of the sport and then the real. And we often don't get to see the real because we're constantly faced with that sport and having to be that tribal side.
Okay, yeah. Well said, Trevor.
I mean, aren't you glad I spoke with him now?
He's definitely right about that tribalism. I think that's what's happening. Or like, maybe it's even worse, like the sport of it all. Like, that's what's kind of so disappointing and scary, honestly.
Yeah. I mean, I think I understand, but Remoy, say more about that. Use more words.
Yeah, like when you make people's livelihoods, their freedom, their security just a game to like win an election, power, whatever, like, and these are vulnerable people. These are people with their livelihoods on the line, and you're using language and emotion to manipulate them. It's super sad, man.
Yeah, that's pretty in line with how Trevor has been seeing it too.
When I go in and chat with men are hurting, right? Men are in pain, men are frustrated, men feel very limited. And like when I ask me like, oh, hey, like if you saw this happening, would you say something? You want to do something? Almost the majority of men, when I'm in workplaces, are like, yeah. But the challenge is they recognize they want to do something different, whether it be for themselves or other people, but they lack the tools. They lack the understanding of how to do it. They also may not have the social capital to do it themselves or other environments that they're in as well. And so I don't find it surprising. What I find frustrating about it is the fact that there are still, whether it be them policing themselves or we're policing each other, that's where I'd find a bit more frustrating and upsetting, is that they're still limited and held back.
Yeah, this is super good context to have. Like, again, there's vulnerable populations throughout, and like Trump and powerful people in his constituency are just targeting and then manipulating those populations at the same time, making them bigger issues than they really may be.
Yeah, and I think of people like Elon Musk, who's donated over $130 million to get Trump elected. He's someone who's championed hypercapitalism and hypermasculinity. And of course, Peter Thiel, whose money and connections were instrumental in getting J.D. Vance in as the VP nominee. Literally from his finance days to his Ohio senator days to now the vice presidential nominee. It's unbelievable. Not to mention all the dark money out there, just like overly influencing politics.
Yeah, politics, or DC as they say, has become a real money-making profession, kind of dependent on donors, special interest groups, PACs. Like, it's cliche to say, but it's really corrupted, or at least it really feels like that. And it's like the civic duty, right? But that's not just on one aisle, it's on all sides of the aisle.
Yeah, on all sides. And Trevor has some good notes about how Trump has really capitalized on this.
How does this sort of relate to like masculinity as this like strong man person on the stage, and people sort of responding to someone, even if it's not in their own personal interests or some of their personal values, is following this persona that they like and they're painting. And then also if something is said that's problematic, and I think this is really what a lot of men sort of experience. It's not just that tribalism of saying like, it's my camp, oh, that was a bad one that they said, but like, I still believe in all this. It's also like, it can be a really challenging thing in male norms to get off the train, to say, hey, I was wrong. That's one thing too far, or like, oh, that's too much for me. I'm not vibing on it, or what have you. To admit that, it's not just to admit it to other people about like, hey, like this is too much for me or what have you. It's also to admit like, I got duped. I was wrong. And maybe we weren't duped, right? Maybe it's just too much. And that is an emasculating thing to do. And in doing that, so we're not also painting an off-ramp for other people in this space in a masculine context where they can actually do that self-assessment for themselves and find that, because they're following a strong man. And it's very tribal, and we're not allowing people to sort of like have true conversations with themselves in a healthy masculine context. We're not allowing people to navigate their exit button, so entrenched in this sort of like masculine norm.
Yeah, so I think Trevor's saying emasculating, right? But not as a pejorative, like he feels that way. He's saying it more like within the binary, like that's how men may be feeling it internally.
Right. Like a lot of men are feeling aggrieved. It's this internalized misogyny that makes them feel lesser for having to ask for support. And that the society around them hasn't equipped them with the thinking and the communication tools to unpack all of that.
So this can all add up and become what's come to be called like aggrieved entitlement.
Exactly. So we talked about this in season 2 with Dr. Michael Kimmel, and really it's an issue that remains. That's the loudspeaker that we're hearing when we hear tones of toxic masculinity.
Okay, I can hear that, but your turn, like talk to me like I'm a first grader. Help me better understand what aggrieved entitlement is.
Yeah, so it's basically this notion that some men were left behind after being sold a pipe dream, right? Like work hard, be patriotic, put in the time, and America will make sure that you're financially and socially set and that you have your rightful place as a man in a society that's essentially designed for your success. You'll get the white picket fence and you'll get respect because you're a man and you've earned it. But that's not actually the reality in many cases.
And a lot of this is tied up somehow in how women have advanced more, let's say, in the workplace over the last 50 or so years, right?
I mean, yes, but also like, have they? Like, yes, but have they really? Like, do you know the gender wage gap?
Right. Okay, my bad. Correction, how some people believe women have advanced more.
Yeah, and actually, Juliana gave great context for some research that Pew did about understanding what public perceptions have been over the last 20 years.
And what we see is that people see a lot more progress for women. So most Americans, very large share of Americans, say that women are now doing better than women were 20 years ago when it comes to getting high-paying jobs, having leadership opportunities in the workplace, going to college, going to a 4-year college. And fewer than half say that men are doing better now than they were 20 years ago. Not that many people think men are necessarily doing worse, but they think men either are doing the same, maybe are doing the same as they had been. So they see progress for women over the last 20 years, whereas they see men being more stagnant over that time. And then when it comes to changing gender roles, we ask people, like the fact that more women are working outside the home than in the past, and more men are, taking care of children and doing household chores than in the past. And we ask what they thought the impact had been on a lot of different things. And people are more likely to say that those changes have made it easier for women to be successful at work and to have satisfying lives than say the same about men. So they think that the benefits of these changing gender roles have been more to women's benefit than to men's benefit. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is that people don't necessarily blame women for, right? They don't think that women's progress has come at the expense of men. So that's a question that we asked. And the vast majority of Americans, including the vast majority of men, don't think that women's gains in society have come at the expense of men.
But that finding doesn't mean the public doesn't feel a change, right? Like Juliana actually went further into this.
Even if people don't think that the gains for women have come at the expense of men, it doesn't mean that they don't see it as a problem, right? It doesn't mean that they're telling us that they think women have made a lot of progress in the last 20 years in these areas related to work and higher ed, and don't see the same progress for men, right? And then they think that the changing gender roles have benefited women more than men. And even if they don't blame women for it, doesn't mean that they don't see that, right? That they don't feel that gap and that disconnect.
Man, I'd imagine that feeling, like that insecurity, has real kind of tangible consequences, especially like when looking at men's experiences.
Yep. And Trevor was really able to expound on that.
But the fear and the insecurity is very real. And that's the thing that has been underaddressed with a lot of men or masculine identifying individuals, is like actually engaging that fear and that insecurity about where they are Think about like if you're a male right now and you're feeling this pain, right? You're being told constantly that you're privileged and like you're at the top of the pyramid and all that, but you're like, I have mental health problems. I don't know if my job is going to still be here, if I'm going to get laid off or what have you, changing industry. I have I'm barely making ends meet. Now, if you have a deeper conversation, obviously, like it's really easy to sort of poke holes and sort of bring people to understanding on that, but it speaks to that fear and insecurity that people have in that moment right now. So like, I actually don't think it's that surprising because it is that fear and speaking to that insecurity is not unique to Donald Trump by any means. It's something that's been utilized by political parties and leaders around the world. Brazil just had it. We just saw it happen in France with one of their challenges on that. Like it is very, very regular in terms of that populist appeal on it. But the populist appeal that's happening right now is really speaking to men's insecurities of those gender norms that they had, right? Being a provider, being sound, being safe, all that type of stuff. And so there is a masculine norm that's really tied up with people's support of Trump.
Yeah, this is a hard one to navigate, right? Like, as what Juliana and her team have found, it's way more nuanced, but the sensitive moments, like especially like in regard how our culture has created these gender norms, maintained them, Trump is like leaning in and capitalizing on that.
Oh, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, it's like him and that machine are using specific rhetoric and language and emotion, honestly, repeatedly to hit people, especially certain men's vulnerabilities.
Yes. And?
Ooh, okay. Yes, and somebody's been taking improv classes. I'm not mad at that.
I wish. But there's another thing that Trump and politicians like him may be capitalizing on, right? Like Trevor, actually Juliana too, really surprised me with what they found.
As men age, they lose their social connection with other men. Think of the fathers you have in your life. How deep is the friend group? And what does that look like in terms of as they start to get older as men? This also speaks to how political groups can actually target those groups, offering them different types of community and belonging, and which side it goes to. Like if someone goes to a Trump rally, right? Like, and obviously I have thoughts around it, but if someone goes there, they're finding community, right? Like those men are finding community there. It's the same thing if someone goes and joins a hunting club, they're finding community. Or if someone's going to play like soccer, they're still finding community. And so it's still the same thing. And so like, I don't villainize that. It's because I understand the need and the want that men have around that's been missing in that space. And these are the places where they're finding that connection, and like battling what they've been missing. And so like, I don't villainize that. It's but more about saying like, if we're building healthier systems for people to find us authentically earlier in their thing, then maybe they don't go into some of these other areas that may not be serving them or maybe against their own interests.
And just a little bit of a preview. I can't share any findings, but we did have some questions in the survey that we did not release in this first report that do deal with social connections and things like that, and friendship, and we look at men and women and where they turn to for support. And that's coming out in November, so stay tuned.
That is like a huge thing we could be missing. Like Trump and these other like MAGA type actors, maybe more than anything, what they're doing is providing community.
Right. Isn't that wild?
And actually, yeah, I see it around me all the time, even in New York, but right now in Texas, more often than not, men, especially even married and like family men, seem to be alone. Like they have their work life, sure, and they have their family, but outside of that, there's no other relationships, especially like male friendships outside of those environments.
Which is so astonishing to me because it's like, who do you talk to? Who do you spend time with? Like, who do you bounce ideas off of?
Who do you joke with? Who do you laugh with?
It must be so lonely.
And this is like what that right-wing rhetoric in like a very effed up way is helping build a community for those individuals. Like you're lacking, so here's that solution, especially for those who may be isolated, those men specifically.
Yeah, and you can see it in all the online spaces as well, right? Like, and then it manifests in like real life too.
That kind of feels like the most manipulative part of all this. Jesus, like what this rhetoric does more than anything, if we can see it, is like it capitalizes on a certain loneliness men and individuals are facing, and it does so by, oddly enough, providing those friendships.
Right, like some actual homies in the process, which...
Yeah, like a place, a group to be a part of.
Yeah. So like, no matter, like, even if that means having to compromise what they think, what they believe, like Juliana has revealed to be part of a group, even if it's a really horrific one, just something that gives them an ounce of space to be part of something with others.
Damn. Yeah. Wow.
Which is crazy.
Super crazy.
We'll see what Juliana and the Pew Research Center's paper bears out.
Wow. Stay tuned indeed, because that's going to be fascinating.
I know, right? Like, I'm excited.
Good stuff, dude. Really.
Well, Remoy, it didn't actually end there.
Okay. Wow. You did a whole show without me? Like even the 5-question beat without me?
Well, let's just say after this break, I get into more questions, maybe 5.
Maybe like 17, but sure.
With Juliana and Trevor.
Is that, wait, okay. Is this what FOMO is? I don't know what FOMO is, but I'm feeling something. Is this what that is?
Okay, Mr. Operatic, stay tuned.
I actually found out later by a friend that Matthew tried to kill himself after that.
What does it look like to go from a perpetrator of violence to an undaunted ally for those who are vulnerable?
So, I mean, that made me feel really guilty, and I couldn't eat anything, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't do anything. I mean, I thought I deserved what he got. And that's when I started talking to you.
This is the story of Lewis, a 12-year-old who went through a remarkable transformation to become the young man he is today. It's also one of the most powerful things I've ever recorded as part of Breaking the Boy Code, a podcast centered on the inner lives of boys and what it looks like for parents and educators to raise the next generation of men. Created in collaboration with Next Gen Men Podcast Network, listen to Breaking the Boy Code podcast wherever you get podcasts.
Okay, so you got 5 questions in, Samantha?
Did I?
Okay, so was your standard 17?
Well, you'll just have to wait and listen, all right? Like,
okay, but let me just answer me this. Did we do the payoff thing? Did you get to one of them get to ask you a question or something?
patience, young Padawan, as my brother would say. Shout out to Sam.
Election times and we're doing Star Wars? Gross.
Well, I'll just say that Star Wars didn't make it into the questions with Juliana and Trevor, but here's what did. Let's just backtrack a little bit here. Like, it's great that this report exists, but how did it come to be? So, like, I know that it's not new, but how did this report start?
I mean, in terms of the idea for it, it really started with all the discussions out there. I mean, we're researchers, but we're also consumers of media and public discourse, and we read things and we listen to podcasts, and we, you know, and these conversations just kept coming up over and over again. And it's very much within our wheelhouse in terms of the things that we study. And we just wanted to go a little deeper on it and really find out how Americans were feeling about it. But some of it really started from our own curiosity as researchers, but also as just people who read a lot and who are interested in this topic. And we just had this curiosity and wanted to learn more about it.
I think it's so important that this report exists for obvious reasons, but like, why is it so important to track this type of information? Like, what does it provide for the public?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think that we live in a hyper-polarized society. We've been in it for a few years. You know, it's, again, the polarization isn't new, but, you know, we do live in an environment where a lot of the information that people consume is coming from sort of, you know, places that they agree with, right? Like, they're seeking out information from people who are going to tell them what they already believe in many ways. And so I think the work that we do, where we do come into these sometimes controversial, sometimes polarized, sensitive topics, and we're approaching it very much from a place of curiosity and a place of wanting to close knowledge gaps and to provide data for people. And some of the data sometimes might challenge their assumptions. Sometimes it might confirm what they already thought. But for us, it's just really important in this environment that we're in, where everything is so just loud and polarized, to come in and just say, sometimes things are a little bit more complicated. Sometimes it's a little bit more nuanced than you thought. And we think that's a value of a lot of the work that we do at the Pew Research Center.
And I especially, you know, to add to that, I think it's so important to understand facts versus narrative. And I think that when we talk about politics and like election, it's really all about narrative, spinning the story, kind of creating a message. And so a lot of the findings in this report actually trump a lot. I mean, not to use this weird pun, but actually trump a lot of the information or like the narratives that have been going around. So of course, obviously Masculinity with a hard K is the name of our show, because we think a lot about how men feel like they have to perform masculinity, even if it's not natural for who they are, right? I think it's so great that the report actually measured how men feel about their own masculinity, right? And so can you talk a little bit about what you discovered there? Like, how do men feel about their own masculinity?
Yeah, and I thought those were really interesting findings. And so basically what we did was we asked all respondents to rate themselves on a scale of masculinity and a scale of femininity. And this is something that, several years ago, we asked a similar question, and we only asked men to rate themselves on the masculinity. We asked about their own masculinity, and we asked women about femininity. And I think over the last several years, it's been, I think, maybe 7 years since we did that study. I think we've learned a lot about gender and the fluidity and the overlaps and all of it. And so we decided to ask both men and women to rate themselves on both of those scales. And then it was a scale from 0 to 4, not at all masculine to extremely masculine, and not at all feminine to extremely feminine. We subtracted the feminine ratings from the masculine ratings and created this one continuous scale. And so we have, that goes from highly feminine to highly masculine. And so what we found is that about 40% or so of men place themselves see themselves as highly masculine. But it was really interesting because we see very big gaps by party. 53% of Republican men see themselves as highly masculine compared to 29% of Democratic men. And so, so that was really interesting. And the other thing that was really interesting with both men and women, but I think with men in particular, because of the conversations out there about young men, is that young men are a lot less likely than older men to see themselves as highly masculine. And that's not just a function of partisanship. We thought maybe it was because, we know that young people lean more Democratic than Republican. But even when we control for party, with Republicans, it was more like younger than 50 and 50 plus, but Republican men younger than 50 were less likely to see themselves as highly masculine than older Republican men. And for Democrats, it was particularly young men younger than 30 who were the least likely. And so I think with a lot of what we've been hearing about young men, when it comes to how they see themselves and how they rate their own masculinity, they're not necessarily seeing themselves as hyper masculine.
That's really interesting because it really, I keep on going back to this like idea of, kind of preying on this idea of masculinity for different interests. And so it's interesting to hear that like where the feeling highly masculine versus not feeling highly masculine falls, both in terms of age and in terms of Democratic Party. Now, I'm going to pivot a little bit because one of the things that I consistently think of in terms of the performance of masculinity is popping up for me. And I really want to ask you about this, Trevor. This question is a little bit more somber. So, Trevor, it feels like Trump campaigns have been very effective at using misogyny to bond men in their masculinity. One thing I want to kind of get some context from you around is what can you tell us about the connection between leadership, violence, and misogyny when it comes to this particular performance of masculinity?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's contrasting views around masculinity play out specifically on this one. This is an archetype that's really like we've seen. I from the political thing, I obviously clearly plays with a specific type of audience. The challenge though is and this is what we're hearing too with the research that's being shared is that like people are starting to move away or at least subscribing differently from that. So I almost revisit what I said at the very top of our conversation, which was there's that tribal, the political sport side of things, and then there's the personal side, and those don't necessarily always line up in the same way. I think the other thing is too, when I think around like some of this thing is like what are like some of the metrics of success that we attach to men? It's like getting a job, being able to provide for family, and getting a place to live, starting a family, all these different types of things. They may look differently to different people, but like those metrics are still somewhat in place. And I think some of this plays into that really deep rooted program thoughts about like what those metrics actually look like when he says like someone needs to be, you need to be at work, someone needs to be at home, you need to this, all that. Like it plays into some of those like early program thoughts that people have, even if they're like, no, like I can share the things, I can do this, I can do that. We're playing into that. So clearly it does work because it's I mean, the polling shows quite tight. But I think what it's done, and I think this is the more interesting thing about it, is it's inspired a tremendous amount of women to come up and start pushing back and having more honest conversations. And it's fine for women to have conversations with women, but women start having conversations with men, which therefore inspires men to start having conversations with men about it, being like, that's whack, eh? That's not how I feel. Like that doesn't fly in my group. And like those type of peer-to-peer engagements is where you'll see the biggest attitudinal behavioral shift. And so like, for me, I look at it and be like, right now I'm like impatient. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. But I'm not thinking like men are now starting to talk. When, what's his name? Harrison, the Chiefs kicker came out and like made the comment about his mom at the commencement speech.
Yeah.
And what that did was it like, in my circles, I work in pretty progressive circles, but like all my friends, even the ones in the States, I work in professional sports spaces. We're all like, that's messed. And like, we're having that conversation. So those type of things, these performances are still going to have a change on masculinity, but it's not necessarily the change that they think's happening because it's actually allowing people to have conversations offline about being like, that's not what it looks like to me. And so I see something different that will come out of it.
This is awesome. And one thing I wanted to ask you is there anything in the report that proved you wrong about your own thoughts in terms of how Americans feel about men and masculinity? Like, were you so surprised like that it completely shifted what you had previously perceived?
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't know that I would say it that way. Like, I don't know if there's anything that was like so surprising necessarily, but I did think it was interesting. I mean, I already touched on it, but like, I did think it was interesting that with all of the narrative about young men, it was interesting to see that like the more like highly masculine, the people who were rating themselves as more highly masculine were older men, right? That it wasn't like the young, you know, like I'm young, I'm like highly masculine, I'm just hyper masculine. Like we didn't see that. And I thought that was really interesting in light of everything we've been hearing about young men.
All right. So now it's your turn to ask you a question. Ask away. I'm all ears.
Yeah. So I was wondering, like, who in the public eye do you think really embodies like a positive version of masculinity?
Wow, what a good question. I mean, I think there are a lot of different people who have spoken about positive masculinity, which I really appreciate. I want to call out Justin Baldoni because I think that his podcasts and like the conversations that he's having on the show really make a difference in terms of like men having conversations and like being able to step into that space, right? Because I think with Trevor, what you said was that, people talk about gender, people talk about different things, but like men don't necessarily see themselves in those conversations. So I feel like he's somebody who's been helpful at being able to kind of make that conversation more accessible. But if I were to say somebody who's like not involved in masculinities, I love some of the basketball players who have been talking about their mental health. So somebody who stands out to me is Jaylen Brown. He like has issues with mental health and he'll just say it. He'll talk to his teammates about it. He'll be just open, and he also champions women. I just really appreciate that. I think that men championing women, championing other genders is like hugely important for the liberation of masculinity. So thank you for asking. I'm glad we had this conversation before the election because honestly, it made me check myself about pointing fingers.
Well, I think you're right about pointing fingers.
But audience, definitely, there's a book coming, right? You feel that?
I think you're right to point fingers, and we have to see everywhere we should point the fingers.
And you're saying?
Again, it sounds cliche or just repetitive, but I think, the American political system is like haggard and broken, and maybe most so how it's exploitative.
Oh, yeah. And we see how Americans, generally speaking, are far more nuanced than how they think.
Yeah, but then you have a system that allows people and parties to go to incredible lengths to be predatory or exploit people's, vulnerabilities.
Using their money, using their sense on all sides of the aisle.
I think so. So
what are we supposed to do, Remoy? Like, how do you go out and vote, quote unquote, in a system that's broken?
yeah, it's a tough one to answer, but I'd like to believe, or I have faith and confidence that we as people, especially as Americans, are like strong and smart enough to hold those two kind of maybe competing facts, like that we need to participate in it to, yes, not have the worst exploitative outcome.
I follow.
But it's also our civic duty to challenge that same system we're participating in. At the same time, to push back on it however we can.
I mean, that does sound easier said than done. How?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I'm going to try my hand at phone banking, not for candidates specifically, but sharing clear information on the issues.
Okay, so that's dope, like super dope you're doing that, but not everyone has time or energy to participate in that way.
Yeah, you're probably right, yeah?
Oh, music to my ears. Sounds great.
Okay.
Want more of that.
But I think what we discovered in this episode, like this information and pushing it into the world, could be a tiny part of that pushback, right? Like it's small, but maybe a model of what that type of participating in challenging the system could look like.
Yeah, listeners, I guess if this resonated with you, something you can do is take what you've heard and share this information, this knowledge that Americans are just less polarized than we think.
Yeah, take that fact that there's actually more opportunity for like cohesion, take that knowledge and use it as a way to start challenging the way we are all thinking. Definitely step towards challenging the political infrastructure we have now.
And we do want to thank Juliana and Trevor for helping us get there, right? We'll be posting all of this on our socials and website, but you can find Juliana on Twitter at JMHorowitz78 and on Instagram at JHorowitz78, as well as throughout the Pew Research Center website. She has a lot of great articles written, a lot of good research. And Trevor is part of the Equity Leaders team at Next Gen Men and is on all socials at Mayoh.
Well, Samantha, it's good to be back despite your best attempts.
Wow. Okay. I mean, it's good to have you back, Remoy, especially since I was not actually going to replace you.
Music to my ears. Let's go.
All right. Well, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to show us some love wherever you get your podcasts.
5 stars, 5 stars.
There he is. And he's right. That will ensure that the conversation reaches more ears. And after today, it feels like more people might be into this than we thought. And then we also have Beneath the Mask back next week with Stephanie Graham. So make sure to get those questions in. What do you need to know about pick-me culture? What do you need to share about pick-me culture? Slide in our DMs with those questions, those comments, and we'll be sure to mention it on the show.
Well, I won't be there, but sure, have fun. I've heard those things can be fun. Sure. Why not?
I mean, I figured that your FOMO levels hadn't quite reached like the whole let me get on socials level. But yeah, we have fun.
Oh, yeah. Good try. But yeah, definitely not reach those levels ever at all. No. But until they may do, I'm your boy, Remoy George Philip the First.
And I'm Samantha Nzesi Kifler. Thank you so much for listening.
Peace.
Ciao.